muito tradicional aqui. E esta semana também, nos próximos 2 dias, vamos ter muitos eventos, muitos sons e muita música. E claro, uma semana como esta exige muito trabalho, portanto, desde já, eu quero reconhecer e agradecer o trabalho, o esforço, o espírito da Viviane Contijo e Everton Vargas da Costa. Muito obrigado. Os colegas são ótimos e têm feito um esforço incrível em organizar esta semana. Portanto, eu espero que todos gostem da nossa sessão de abertura, da música, e agora vou chamar a minha colega, a doutora Viviane Contijo, para fazer a apresentação. Viviane.
Boa tarde. Eu tinha preparado alguma coisa para falar com vocês em inglês, porque eu sei que talvez não tivéssemos todos falando em português aqui. Temos? Eu all speak português. Tá? Sim? Sim? Não? Okay. So I will stick to the plan. Okay. So I'm very proud to present to you this 13th annual Brazil Week, as well as the first Luso Week at Harvard University. Following a tradition that began in 2003, thanks to our pioneering beloved friend with her vision and efforts, Dr. Clemence Costre, and Professor Nicolau Sevchenko, who supported also the initiative of Clemence. Brazil Week shines light on a different aspect of Brazil each year in April. The theme of Brazil Week and Luso Week this year is Os Sons da Lusofonia. The celebration of the sounds of Brazil, Portugal, and Cabo Verde assembles lovers of Lusophone from all around the globe and aims to promote the exchange of ideas and experiences among students, scholars, and professionals. Brazil Week and Luso Week 2015 are sponsored by the generous support of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, the Robert C. Smith Jr. Fund for Portuguese Studies, and the General Consulate of Brazil. Just before we get started, I would like to express my gratitude to all of you who so generously helped me make this event come together smoothly, or almost smoothly. Everton da Costa, Heloísa Pedrosa, Cíntia Torres, Casey Tucker, Benedict Cruz, Juliana De Leo, Nicole User, and all the teachers, students, and the staff for the Portuguese program. I could not do anything without all of you. So thank you very much. And we will start with Professor Dário Borim. Professor Borim is a full professor of Luso-Afro-Brazilian Studies at UMass Dartmouth. He is also a blogger, a concert producer, a creative writer, an internet radio show host programmer, a photographer, and a translator. He has been producing and presenting the show Brazilians on WUND 89.3 for over 13 years. Among his books are Crônicas Brasileiras, the reader, the English version of Helena Jobim's Antônio Carlos Jobim, An Illuminated Man, and Perplexidades, Raça, Sexo e Outras Questões Sociopolíticas. His writings mostly focus on the interplay of literature and music, have been included in distinguished volumes such as Music and Dictatorship in Europe and Latin American Embodies and Biases, Issues of Sexualities in Hispanic Cultures at University of Minnesota Press 1996. Other books and periodicals from Belgium, Brazil, France, Peru, Taiwan, and I will skip this part. He will talk to us about the Brazilian, Portuguese, and Cape Verde music. So the title of his lecture is From Moda to Modinha, Fado, Tropicalia, and Beyond, Brazilian Music in the Lusophone World. So please help me to welcome Professor Daribo.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's a gorgeous day out there, and I'm delighted that you're here to share this time. The program is fascinating. Thank you, Professor Montijo. Thank you, all of you, for coming here, for everybody to help put this event together. I am really impressed by the quality of what's coming next after me, and I'm so glad to be here. I wish I were one of you sitting there and just watching. I'm glad to talk to those who know me personally or know me as a professor. Well, I like talking. Most of us in literature, actually, right? Or in the academic world. Anyway, the title remains the same, okay? From Moda to Modinha, Fado, Tropicalia and beyond, Brazilian music in the Lusophone world. Of course, the title is huge. And I will shed some light on what the role, I guess, of music within our cultures, the Portuguese-speaking cultures around the world. I will open a little bit of a controversy, probably, with perhaps even my colleagues who are strictly in literature. But it's just that I would like to respond a little bit to the title of the event as a whole, which is Os Sons da Lusofonia, the sounds. And that goes beyond music, of course. Germano Almeida, Cape Verdean author, says it plainly. A language, like the Portuguese, is the most efficient means of communication. He argues that when he goes to France, he feels like a foreigner, but he does not feel the same when he travels to a Portuguese-speaking country. He adds that the language we share allows for Cape Verdeans like him to read literature from Angola, Brazil, Mozambique, Portugal, and São Tomé, for instance, which helps people in these different countries feel closer to each other. On the interpersonal level of human communications, I agree with Almeida. The idiom is the most efficient means. On the level of communications through the arts, though, I'm not so sure the language is the most important element. For me, literature is definitely not the most efficient means of communication among us, Lusophone speakers, from country to country. Music is. I have several arguments, but I will highlight three. Except for Portugal, there has been a high level of illiteracy in our countries. Two, literature has been mostly produced and consumed within the small world of social economic elites. Three, an idiom in general and the written language in particular are restricted and restrictive, or as Brazilian writer Graciliano Ramos puts it, we are oppressed by rules of grammar and social hierarchies associated with so-called proper or improper use. To appreciate music, in turn, one, we do not need schooling, so the poor and the uneducated not only enjoy music, two, they create and perform it abundantly in every corner of the Portuguese-speaking world. And three, despite its internal and external structures, and despite the hips of tradition, as tropicalist singer-songwriter Tom Zé calls it, every song and every performance enjoy and thrive on an unlimited scope of freedom and room for innovation. Let's elaborate a little bit on the third point. Within and beyond or beyond the limits of morphology, semantics, and syntax, very few writers defy or recreate the written language to the extent that musicians do on a regular basis by simply changing his or her voice in a way that provokes laughter, for instance, or by bringing in harmony in such a fashion that may never be repeated. Exceptionally, Mozambique's renowned author, Mia Couto, highlights that rare bend toward defiance and innovation within the literary world. In this regard, he speaks of the trail of influences that led him to be the writer that he is. Couto confesses his aesthetic debt to Angolan writer José Luandino Vieira, who found much of his inspiration for linguistic freedom and creativity in the writings of author João Guimarães Rosa. Curiously enough, Angolan novelist José Eduardo Agualusa explains that Luandino Vieira's penchant for literary distortions and deviation grew mightier, not only inspired by Guimarães Rosa's unique prose style, but also from the determination not to produce literature that resembled Portuguese literature. One of Vieira's ultimate goals, adds Agualusa, was to write books of which no reader from Portugal could possibly claim national ownership. The political context behind Vieira's literary use of the Musek, a fusion of the Kimbundu and the Portuguese, was obviously the independence wars in Africa and the sense of ownership of the language and literature sustained and propagated by the colonial power. It is the Portuguese modernist poet Fernando Pessoa who reveals, quote, "Minha pátria é minha língua," that is to say, my country is my language. This confession can be an interesting point of departure for the critique of the powers and limitations of Lusophonia, whether it is seated in language, literature, music, other arts, or national identity. One of the Brazilian singer-songwriters with the greatest or the strongest ties to the cultures of the Portuguese-speaking countries outside Brazil, and to that of Portugal in particular, is Caetano Veloso, who, among other zillion things, has composed and performed pieces of folly. The presence of Portugal and the Portuguese language as a theme in his music is the topic of a paper I wrote in Portuguese and published in the Luso Brazilian Review nearly a decade ago. It perhaps is worth revisiting it now. Focusing specifically on two of his songs, É Proibido Proibir, It's Prohibited to Prohibit, 1968, and Língua, Language, 1984. That discussion discerns Veloso's contradictory stance on language, aesthetics, and ideology. For contextualization and further insight into Veloso's linguistic and cultural politics, his views are compared to those of Olavo Bilac in his poem Língua Portuguesa, That was a European Portuguese accent. Língua portuguesa, língua portuguesa, right? The Portuguese language, 1916. And to those of Portugal's modernist bard, Fernando Pessoa, in his books Mensagem, Message, 1934, and A Língua Portuguesa, the Portuguese language, 1997. Of course, that's posthumous and it's an anthology. He only published, Pessoa only published Mensagem while alive. Just one book. É Proibido Proibir can be considered a protest song. It was initially interpreted in a political and aesthetic happening, the art form that preceded today's practices known as performance, such as those by music iconoclasts like the United States composer John Cage, the Belgrade-born art celebrity Marina Abramović, and so many other polemical, non-conformist, and highly innovative artists. That song's short and simple lyrics constitute a sarcastic and sardonic reaction to Catholic mores and the stagnation, aesthetic thoughts, and political stands held by conservative Brazilians in general, especially those of a xenophobic faction of the petit bourgeois youth of São Paulo. The song's title, É Proibido Proibir, it's prohibited to prohibit, is obviously an oxymoron that reissues the political slogan of May 1968 street protests in France. Symbolic images in that song decry sexual repression of women in Brazil. In addition, they create scenes of vandalism and a futuristic destruction of icons of social status, wealth, and the so-called good taste and prestige associated with it. Quote, cars are scorching in flames. We'll bring it all down, all shelves and statues, all window panes, china, and books. During the debut enactment of the Proibido Proibir, Veloso recites Fernando Pessoa's poem, Dom Sebastião, with a first stanza that translates into, well, behold, I have fallen into a quicksand, and in the adverse hour which God bestows upon his offspring for the moments when one's soul immerses into dreams that are God himself. The concluding stanza by Pessoa runs like, quote, what is the matter with a quicksand? Death and misfortune. That which I have dreamed myself will endure eternally. That is the one by which I will return. In his long book, Tropical Truth, written in the mid-1990s, Veloso explains his reverence for what he mythically perceives as Pessoa's sublime and dexterous use of the Portuguese language, especially in the poems published in Mensagem. Faced with Pessoa's verses, says Veloso, the reader would feel the presence of something deeper and more meaningful than words, because, quote, every syllable, every sound, and every idea suggested appear to be there out of the Portuguese language's necessity to exist. It is as if those poems were the founders of the Portuguese language or its ultimate justification, unquote. Since the Portuguese modernist poet was a purist in his linguistic thoughts and a propagandist seeking to promote Portugal's empire, it is provocatively contradictory how the Brazilian singer-songwriter uses Pessoa's writing in a musical happening that attacks both the Brazilian military dictatorship's oppression and the Brazilian middle class students' nationalist essentialism. Very significantly, though, Pessoa's notion of empire was not a colonialist enterprise of economic possession or political oppression, but a spiritual one, defended and defined by the power and integrity of the Portuguese language as a world language of affection, literature, and sensibility. Against Pessoa's belief in the Portuguese language's integrity, though, Veloso's musical contradictions in linguistic and aesthetic terms coalesce into a second major episode when approximately 15 years later, Brazilian popular music had evidently expanded globally. He then writes and records with loud and bombastic singer Elza Soares the eccentric and tropicalist song Língua, which displays a poetic structure that echoes T.S. Eliot's collage of images. The song includes pastiche and other quotes or references to dozens of writers and artists, including Fernando Pessoa and Brazil's most celebrated Parnassian poet, Olavo Bilac, whose conservative take on language runs similar to those of the Lisbon modernists. Bilac's view of the Portuguese language is so deeply rooted in notions of integrity and purity that in his sonnet, Língua Portuguesa, he highlights his love for that idiom in pain and sorrow. He distinguishes what he sees as raw and unpolished aspects of the Brazilian variant of the idiom. It is as though, quote, bruta mina, right, unquote, of Minas Gerais, a bruta mina, a brute mine of Minas Gerais, a microcosm for Brazil as a whole, looked after the shattered and dying language, pieces of that language spoken around it. However, in Língua, a musical mosaic we could describe as a transnational dancing farce, Veloso's rap, salsa, and samba rhythms rejoice at the Portuguese language's multiplicity of ethnic, regional, national, and social economic variants. Rather than supporting integrity, the Brazilian singer-songwriter urges us in rampant mockery and playful anarchy to pay attention to the constant innovation of the way Brazilians communicate while incorporating various linguistic fads, neologism, native concepts, and names apart from foreign accents and foreign words. Veloso also inverts Pessoa's heteronym Bernardo Soares' famous assertion, minha pátria é minha língua, my country is my language, to something else, to, quote, a língua é minha pátria, e eu não tenho pátria, tenho mátria, e quero pátria. Unquote. So language is my country, and I have no patriarchy. I have matriarchy, and I want fraternity. Unquote. Veloso's approaches to issues of aesthetics and nationalism are indeed paradoxical. They display a solid relationship, generally diachronic, but sometimes synchronic, and a reaction against the historical context in which they appear. Lyrics, melody, rhythm, and arrangements of the proibido, proibir, and língua fit perfectly in a direct but multi-layered articulation with the social and historical factors that inspire them. In contrast, Pessoa's inconsistent take on politics and ideology exhibits a diachronic multiplicity of attitudes, defended by 72 or more patronyms. Like Pessoa, however, Veloso's core of consciousness, or flashes of superior consciousness, whatever you might see in it, are flabbergasted by the mysteries of the self and society. Those mysteries, so sharply framed in Veloso's sophisticated and wise poetry, make his art convey a rare recognition of the value of the logos and the spoken or written word within the world of popular music and far beyond. Veloso's art is part of his simultaneously rigorous and entertaining rationalization on the chaotic sides of the Portuguese as a world language. Within his digressions on what ties Portugal to Brazil and all other former colonies, there comes a provocative and satisfying dose of poetic philosophy. It unfolds itself in such a unique fashion that we cannot encounter it in formal and or academic studies. It dwells and expands on a mythic type of nationalism that barely survives in a materialistic and cynic world prevailing in the West since the second half of the 20th century. Popular music, as we know it, that is, a huge part of what constitutes today's mass culture, did not exist before the recording of sounds was made possible in the late 1800s. It was in the following century, of course, with advances of radio and television broadcasting, that popular music reached continuously increased levels of melodic and poetic refinement, and most notably, ultra-fast international dissemination. Since the 1990s, of course, the internet has played an even more aggressive role in allowing for experimentation and globalized exchanges of music. The global village already existed in the middle of the previous millennium, however, when daring Europeans inaugurated and expanded the transcontinental routes of commerce and the controversial aggressions of colonialism. Unlike literature, nearly always bound by the constraints discussed earlier in this lecture, illiteracy, elitism, and rigid rules, music has always traveled most freely from region to region, country to country, and continent to continent. The Portuguese-speaking world is no exception. The ukulele and the Rebecca joined and mingled with native Brazilians' flutes and percussions more than 500 years ago. A few decades later, African rhythms started to help mold numberless genres and traditions. The direction of that flow was never exclusively running from Europe to Africa to Brazil. One remarkable moment in the history of this other flow, that is, from Brazil to Europe, was when Domingos Caldas Barbosa, 1740-1800, an African Brazilian poet and priest who loved playing the guitar and disliked wearing clergy robes, was living in Lisbon. For King Dom José I and his daughter Maria, he sang modinhas brasileiras, a genre that had evolved from the Portuguese moda. According to historian, and he's a big historian, José Ramos Tinhorão, those were the days when, for the first time in the last decade of the 1700s, a musician performed popular songs among modinhas and Angolan Brazilian lungus in the aristocratic salons. The poet priest, Barbosa, would employ the language of cafés, which he enriched by incorporating troubadours' lexicon, onomatopoeias, African and Brazilian terms, and unprecedented references to day-to-day deeds. Another pivotal moment of that exchange, Brazil-Portugal, was when Francisca Gonzaga, 1847-1935, an African Brazilian woman, conductor and composer, moved to Lisbon in 1904. Before returning to Rio in 1909, that groundbreaking musician performed assiduously while giving the Portuguese an opportunity to learn firsthand about the rich musical developments in Brazil, including the type of music which Gonzaga herself wrote and added to her own operettas, from choro to machixe to machinhas. The machinhas would soon be very fashionable. By far, the favorite type of music specifically written for Carnaval and cinema during at least half a century in Brazil. In her repertoire for Lisbon, Gonzaga would include, of course, her composition known as the first machinha ever written, O Abre Alas from 1899. Approximately 1 century after Gonzaga's 5 years of living in Lisbon, there I was, dancing by myself at a park near the city's harbor, until 2 males approached me and took me by both hands to join the crowd on a musical merry-go-round of sorts. It was my turn to be flabbergasted. The music itself, though, sounded familiar. It was June 13th, and Lisbon honored the patron Saint Anthony. That old type of song, resonating all around, brought me saudade of the bygone carnival days in my little town, Paraguaçu, in the south of Minas Gerais. Our machines in Paraguaçu, such as those by Gonzaga, Abre Alas in particular, and those marchas populares of Portugal were very similar. Again and again, I was proud and intrigued by the deep and wide links among us all, music lovers of the Portuguese-speaking world. The Portuguese-speaking world is for sure a linguistically and musically mutant world, where language is gradually and continuously given more freedom by music. I venture to say so, especially because of the power which Brazilian popular music today holds throughout and outside Brazil. In contrast, I believe literature written in Portuguese may never, ever regain the power it used to exert over the rules, makeup, and slow, very slow changes allowed to its standard register. Popular music, which started to spread out all over the world via mass culture media, stole the picture. In conclusion, I'm not convinced that the Portuguese language brings us, its speakers, and a significant degree of equality or common identity across the globe. What that language does offer us, though, is, and it is either through literature, music, or the other arts, and or interpersonal relations, is, of course, a greater ability to understand each other within and beyond the Portuguese language itself. It is a type of understanding that does not come from the words alone, despite multiple acts and patterns and other differentiating attributes, but also from the world of common and or related experiences accumulated along the centuries through colonialism and its aftermath, through new power relations, through centuries of diaspora, and through the undaunted voices of art. As suggested before in Lingua, Caetano Veloso applies his sharp tongue on a peppery commentary of a great deal of humor and sarcasm. When he relates to the power which Brazilians hold in the ongoing transformations of the Portuguese language, a power due to the size of Brazil's economy and the population, due to the amazing following of TV global network productions, especially its soap operas throughout the Lusophone world, due to the way Brazilians are creative and irreverent with their own language, and due to the presence and prestige of the Brazilian music worldwide. It's ironic, but Caetano Son Persona says, quote, "Sejamos imperialistas." Let's become imperialists. We should not take any poetic or non-poetic statement by Caetano Veloso out of context. This is one more case. He's delightfully sarcastic while getting out a playful and fake post-colonial slogan off his chest. My reading is that he's implying how we, Portuguese speakers, must carry a role in music and society. Let's do our best to help make the world turn more relaxed, joyful, and freer to experiment artistically with images, melodies, and words that defy narrow-mindedness, stagnation, xenophobia, and oppression. Thanks. For those who can stay, I do have a video clip of Lingua. It's for us to watch now and perhaps entertain some questions and answers in case there's time. All right? So we're going to scene 2. Thanks. And it's just all set. The volume, I guess, is set. No.
Obrigado, mais uma vez, obrigado, professor Dário. A gente vai então assistir o vídeo, depois convido vocês a fazerem perguntas. Temos uma recepção esperando por nós lá fora, com não só os sons da lusofonia, mas com os sabores da lusofonia, e convido a todos para participar. Logo em seguida a gente tem uma percussão de música, uma percussão corporal, com os ritmos bem inusitados do Brasil, como o maracatu, a cucuriá e vários outros ritmos, ciranda. É um grupo artístico interessante que veio de San Diego, nós de Chita, vai dar um workshop de percussão corporal, e em seguida temos um show aqui reunindo esses ritmos, tá? Então fique com a gente, vamos ver o vídeo e vamos nos comunicar. Temos alunos queridos ali, os meus meninos, querem conversar com vocês também.
Just about 4 or 5 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes. Sim, diferente, né? Essa tecnologia não é de antes de eu nascer, mas aí.
Our image mute should press that to stop the mute. This okay. No, this just the
Vamos iniciar com as perguntas enquanto o problema técnico aqui se resolve, então, tá?
right, more than welcome to Evandro, please say this. It's just that the video is not going. Try that.
Okay. Oh my God, yeah. Okay. I like that. Okay, so let's do that.
Roçar a língua de linguística correta.
That's from the beginning. Thanks.
So I'll be more than glad to. Anyway, so open to any questions or commentaries. We glad to entertain your thoughts. Did it make sense? Nobody? Oh, yes, thanks.
Why do you think that was Caetano Veloso, out of all the Brazilian musicians, who end up reaching out across the ocean?
Caetano Veloso, who?
Who, from all the Brazilian musicians, why do you think there was Caetano Veloso? So what's about Caetano Veloso that made him reach out across the ocean, I guess, you know?
You mean the one who
Right.
established or
Right.
worked on these ties with the
Right.
rest of the Portuguese-speaking world?
Yeah.
I think it's a good question. I had planned to talk about all their other figures, but including Martinho da Vila. Martinho da Vila is a legendary name in
Right.
samba history. And since I didn't before, I'll say no, then I'll go back to Caetano. But Martinho da Vila is one of the very few musicians in Brazil who do their best to connect again with Africa through music and dance and choreography, especially with the Carnival and Rio scene, right? In Bahia, there are many ties down in other parts of Brazil, but with the visibility of Caetano Veloso or Martinho da Vila, I think Martinho da Vila is really laudable that way because it's an important recognition of the roots, and in a sense, it's a recognition of what is with us, who we are, and where we're progressing parallel and also in conjunction with what's happening in Africa, right? And Caetano Veloso, I think, has been that person with a very deep intellectual connection with Portugal and to connection with singers from Portuguese-speaking Africa, because he grew up at a time and at a place where there was a lot of respect for Lusophone cultures. I'm thinking of the 40s and 50s in Bahia, where radio played a lot of fados, where in school people studied seriously the history of the Portuguese-speaking world. And in college, at the University of Bahia, he was left for several reasons. I'll mention two. I could mention 4 or 5, but 2. The University of Bahia was exploding. The rector, the president, was bringing artists and intellectuals from around the world to teach there. Oh, hello, I'd like to be there, right? So he was in that environment. And among them, then the second point, among them, Agostinho da Silva, this Portuguese intellectual and writer who resuscitated the Dom Sebastião myth, but with a twist, something different and something connected with Africa and the diaspora of the African nations and Brazil. And Caetano absorbed a lot of that. So he was very sensitive to the Portuguese culture and to the Portuguese-speaking cultures of Africa from home, from school, and I think from an intellectual persona, an intellectual stand that he developed throughout his life. So I think that's, and it's really deep. And it's also deep in his sister's history, right? His sister's, Maria Bethânia's history as a singer. She always, or nearly always, has great poetry that, of course, then it's like revitalizing poetic culture, the literature, but also revitalizing our ties to the rest of the world where the language is spoken, and particularly to Fernando Pessoa.
Right.
Fernando Pessoa, as those of you who know Pessoa a little bit or a lot, it's a wealth. His legacy is a wealth of knowledge and contradiction and surprise and beauty, right? And so,
Right.
Maria Bethânia, Caetano Veloso's sister, is also a voice of that culture. So that's why. Thank you for the question. Yes.
I only heard the last part of your talk. It was very interesting. I wonder along those lines,
Sure.
if you could say who today in Brazil is the successor to Caetano Veloso or is from that period. So it's important.
Okay. One way of answering that question is to say that the tropicalist movement, which strictly speaking lasted a couple of years, from 69, 68, 1968 to 70, 71, in strict terms, right? But in real terms, let's say in broad sense, it's here today, and it will be forever. So then we go back there and see how what Caetano Veloso, Gilberto Gil, Tom Zé, Os Mutantes, Rita Lee, what those guys did to the history of music was to open very wide gates to experimentation, to the non-acceptance of claims that this is art, this is not art. So they're very dadaistic, very deeply dadaistic. Who are we? Who are they out there? Who is anybody to say this is art, this is not art, right? So those guys, like the vanguard folks, of so many decades before, they asserted that in music. So what was the consequence? The consequence was a freedom to combine musical languages, to combine different instruments, to combine something that the Beatles did too. But hello, I'm so glad to say the Beatles came right in a world that was already connected by television and radio. And so a lot of things were happening at the same time. True, the tropicalists were influenced by the Beatles when, John plays the sitar, but the tropicalists went further in their aesthetic claims of freedom and interest, curiosity. Let's open our ears to different possibilities in terms of sounds, and let's be free to combine different languages, different instruments, musical languages, I'm saying, right? So I could say that there is a generation, not already 2 or 3 generations that came after that, And today you may think of Chico César, Lenine, and Adriana Calcanhoto. They would not exist. They would not exist as musicians, I believe, were not for the work, not just Caetano, but Gilberto Gil and the Mutantes, those folks that were discovered here in the United States 20 years later. Yeah, because we're on the periphery, right? Brazil was on the periphery of world music then, not now, right? But when David Byrne and John Pareles of the New York Times started writing about these incredible songwriters from Brazil, then the US caught up, the rest of the world caught up. When they found this CD, I don't know if you guys know this story, but they found a CD in Paris that the Mutantes had recorded and forgotten about it. They were so far out. I mean, yeah, okay, that's not good, but the point is that when that CD, Cadeloscópio, it's in Portuguese, and now there's an English title, right? Cadeloscópio. And it's just amazing, musically amazing, how they were so far advanced at that point, right? So after that, world music, as we know it, was never the same because people from around the world were now exchanging, mixing, blending, mashing up sounds and traditions with total freedom. That's the point, you know? And more and more. And today, the scenario is vast that way, with people traveling in music around the world. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
But there were some, you're talking about language, some got into the Spanish world also. Really,
What's that?
some of them got into the Spanish world. Like
True.
Nelson Net, the Little Giant. I mean, I grew up with that guy. He could really get a group crying and screaming and a lot of other things. Roberto Caldo, you know, they just got out there and they spread Brazil to the rest of the world.
That was another effort too, was to reach out and get the whole of Latin America together.
I mean, that
was beautiful too.
I see.
Done by Mercedes Sosa.
Yeah, Mercedes Sosa, yeah.
Victor Jara.
Yeah.
Violeta Parra.
Oh, yeah.
Right, from Chile and
I grew up with all of
Argentina.
those. Yeah. Pilar Payún, Inti Liman, you know.
But then they have political
Yes,
motivations.
well,
right?
you have to grab
Political
that.
motivation.
Yeah, you have to have that. I mean, that's
Right.
like dominated the whole.
But you see,
Continent,
I want to
really.
point out though that the Tropicalists had an issue with the politics too,
Yeah.
you know, because they saw how the left, you know, I'm a leftist.
Yeah,
you
but
know,
that was
the
part of the
left,
equation. That you
But
have to
how
take
they
sides.
were left to the left, you know, they had a lot of issues with the left,
Yeah.
you know, because of narrow-mindedness. If you then think that all music should be political, that all music should talk about starvation, exploitation, racism,
Yeah.
hello, you know, right? So they had that problem with the left. But they were quick to point out those problems too.
Yes.
You know, not everywhere, not in every song.
Não gosto de interromper um papo tão bom.
We
Nós vamos
continue.
continuar o papo com uma taça de vinho,
All right.
sorrisos e comidinhas.
Thank you so much.
Até mais, obrigada, gente.